Welcome to the Max Future Weekly Podcast. All Apple talk and no chit chat.
Okay, welcome to the Apple Podcast. This is episode 92, and today is Friday, October 7th, 2011. And this week's episode is going to deal with really two topics. One that is very sad, the passing of Steve Jobs at the age of 56. He is the co-founder of Apple and one of its driving forces, the main driving force behind Apple. And of course, we're going to talk about the launch of the iPhone 4S the day before Steve Jobs' death. So that's what this week's episode is going to be devoted to. Remember, this is a chit-chat-free podcast, all Apple talk, and this week is truly going to be all Apple talk. So here we go. All right, wow, what a week. What a week indeed. Well, people have known for a long time that Steve Jobs has been sick, and the few pictures we've seen over the course of the year showed him what appeared to be that he was deteriorating. Well, it was still quite a shock. On October 5th, in the evening, Apple sent out a press release announcing that that day Steve Jobs had died, had passed away at the age of 56. And, I found out, and I think a lot of people are going to remember how they found out. For a lot of people, particularly those in the Apple community, Apple employees, Apple alumni, Apple customers, Apple fans, Mac fans, all kinds of people, we're all in shock. We're not in shock because we didn't have some expectation that Steve Jobs may die. It's rather that he was such a force, his personality was such a force, his being was such a force, and his being was such a force in our lives, particularly those who are Apple customers like me or Mac fans or Apple fans, that his not being around anymore is kind of a shock. It's like something empty. To make a Star Wars, remember in Star Wars there's that famous moment in Star Wars when a planet is destroyed by the Death Star, and Obi-Wan Kenobi, even though he's not there, he feels it. He feels that there's been some darkness or something bad happen in the Force, and he sort of buckles over. And I think a lot of people, when they got the news that Steve Jobs passed away, had that same feeling that Obi-Wan Kenobi had, that there's something bad happened in the Force. And here, the something bad happened was that Steve Jobs passed away. And the way I found out was it was early in the evening of Wednesday, October 5th. And I got a call from a relative who's really not that much into Apple or anything like that. And I guess there had been breaking news on TV. And the person called me and said, Did you hear? And I said, What? Steve Jobs died. And, I didn't cry. I was just sort of stunned. Like, wow, it's happened. We've known he's been sick. He's been battling cancer since 2004. But, you just hoped and you were positive that he would find a way to hold on. And he wasn't able to hold on. If you're looking at the video version of this podcast, this is the picture on ABC News' website, Steve Jobs, 1955 to 2011. And Flickr, I'm going to look at Flickr has a nice pictures of Steve Jobs, and I'll be flipping through it as I talk about him. So let's see. I'll get to some quotes about him. Everybody on the internet, famous, not so famous, has quotes for Steve Jobs. But let me start it off with let's start off with what what he meant for me, what Apple meant for me, and we'll go on to other topics. So for me, I guess Steve Jobs sort of entered my life when I bought my Macintosh. And my first Macintosh, believe me, was one of the first Macintoshes. It was a Macintosh Plus. It had 1 megabyte of RAM. And so it wasn't the original model. It was the model after the original. And I got it, I hate to date myself here, I got it in 1986. And it blew my mind away because it truly was like nothing like any computer had ever been before. When I had been in high school, I had taken some computer classes, and the computer classes really involved like one of those like machines, teletype machines or something, or a typewriter connected to like a mainframe computer. In college, I took some computer courses. It wasn't my major. And I remember learning Fortran, and it just, to me, I wasn't a real like computer geek. To me, computers were too difficult. I remember thinking, I don't want to like type, commands out, like, type instructions. But that's how computers were. They were these sort of abstract devices. Prior to the typing in commands, you had card punches. And to me, it's just like, who wants to use a computer? It's so complicated just to have something done. And then I heard about the Macintosh. Now, remember, the Macintosh came out in 1984, and I was on a university campus, and I got it through the schools. The school got it like a discount, and I got a Macintosh. And the main reason I got it was to do word processing, because that was really cool. Like, this was much cooler than a typewriter, because remember, with typewriters, you were sort of stuck what you're typing. Yeah, you might be able to sort of erase some words that went back a couple of lines. And then with some more advanced typewriters, you could maybe go back several lines. I remember my dad had some sort of very advanced IBM typewriter. And I thought it was so cool that like you could type a whole bunch of things, it would store it in memory and then spit it out. I remember he had like a typewriter where you could type like a page or two, and then they could just retype the whole thing again because it would store it in memory. But I remember wanting the Macintosh because, I was in school and you could use it for word processing. You could cut and paste or reformat like a document and not lose all the text and print it out. And that was just mind-blowing, truly mind-blowing. I'm flipping through pictures of Steve Jobs as I say this. So here's actually a picture of him with Bill Gates and Walter from Wall Street Journal. But anyways, let's go back to the Macintosh. So, but here's what's interesting. Steve Jobs has passed away, and I'm talking about my initial obtaining a Macintosh. This is when Steve Jobs entered my conscious. And he may have been fired at this point, but I became aware that this guy had created this fabulous, fabulous computer, because then I realized you could do other things with the Macintosh. You could hook up musical instruments to them, and I got into like MIDI, using MIDI interfaces. And back in the early days of the Macintosh, you could control these electronic synthesizers, musical instruments, through a Mac, and you could record your music. It would record the musical instruments. This is back in the late 80s. And I, as a hobby, started doing this. And this was just like wild. It was so creative. And of course, you had like a painting app, and you could use the mouse to paint. And this was just like mind-blowing. To me, this was like accessible computing. And so that's when, he really came on my conscience. And then, of course, I always purchased after that for my home, wherever I was living, I had a Mac. I never had a Windows computer at home, ever. In fact, I've never owned a Windows computer. The only computers I've ever owned have been Apple computers. And at work, I've always had a Windows computers. So, and I always appreciated, like, I just couldn't understand why anybody would have a Windows computer. The aesthetic of the Mac was just so amazing. So that's when he first came into my conscience. And I'll tell you, like, I always, there's a couple of things I've always, admired about him and found, like, cool about him. If you look at all of these pictures at Apple events, he's always, like, wearing jeans, blue jeans or dark jeans. And I thought this was so cool. And a black turtleneck. Like, he was basically saying, look, in corporate America, we don't have to be stuffy. We can be practical. We can be dressed down. And he always dressed down. He was so unpretentious in how he dressed. I mean, even his jeans look kind of ripped up. And he so looks down to earth. Now, remember back in the early days when he had these, pictures of him, he was wearing like a tux and had like a bow tie. But in recent years, he was just so practical and down to earth. It was pretty spectacular that he could do that and be the head of such a massive and successful company. So that's one thing that always struck me about him. But the other thing that struck me, is that, we all so anticipated his presentations, like his annual presentations or his biannual presentations, his presentations at WWDC, when he would present like a new device or new software. And what I really admired was just his enthusiasm and passion and the way he carefully crafted his presentation. It wasn't stuffy. It wasn't awkward. But it was emphatic. And the way he spoke to us in these presentations, he doesn't speak down to you like he's some stuffy corporate chieftain. Instead, he talks to you in these presentations as if he's an acquaintance or a friend of yours who is trying to convince you of something. Like, you're going to love this. You're going to love this. He makes himself in all these presentations very accessible. You feel like it's the guy you sort of know, like a friend of a friend who's at your house, and the friend of a friend whips out of his pocket some device and says, hey, let me show you this device that I bought. It's so cool. You're going to love it. And that's something we all do as geeks, right? We all love our devices, and we evangelize to our friends and family and say, hey, look at this device. Look how cool this device is. You're going to love it. And Steve Jobs, in all these presentations, he's like that. He makes himself accessible, and he's convincing you that this is great, that you'll love it. And not convincing you like, he's some stuffy corporate chieftain, but he's your buddy, he's your guy, he's your acquaintance, he's the person you know, and he's going to sell this stuff to you. So anyways, I'm kind of blown away by the fact that he's dead. There really is not going to be anyone like him. Really, is there anyone like him who's almost like he's very infectious as a personality? Someone who really loves what he makes and wants you to like it too, but without overselling it. He never crossed the line. Anyways, that's, I guess, my initial thought on it. Okay, so almost immediately on the 5th, Apple put up a website page at www.apple.com/Steve Jobs. And it was kind of a sad, a nice tribute to him. It just said Steve Jobs against a black white ground, 1955 to 2011, and it said this: Apple has lost a visionary and creative genius and the world lost an amazing human being. Those of us who have been fortunate enough to know and work with Steve have lost a dear friend and an inspiring mentor. Steve leaves behind a company that only he could have built, and his spirit will forever be the foundation of Apple. And also, if you want to, it says if you'd like to share your thoughts, memories, and condolences, please email rememberingsteve@apple.com. So that was pretty nice. It's pretty classy. But obviously there was reactions from lots of people, and there's a website that sort of aggregated a lot of the quotes that came out called webpronews.com, Steve Jobs' death quotes. So here's what some of the people said. Steve Jobs' family said, quote, "In his public life, Steve was known as a visionary. In his private life, he cherished his family. We are thankful to the many people who have shared their wishes and prayers during the past year of Steve's illness." Steve Wozniak, his high school and post-high school friend who co-founded Apple with him, who's one of the nicest human beings I think out there, said, quote, "It's like the world lost a John Lennon. I mean, Steve was clearly the most outstanding business thinker, and almost everybody high up in the technology business recognized that somehow he had the ability to think out new ways of doing things, not just ways to improve what we have, do a better vision of something, but do it in a totally different way that the world would swing towards," end quote. Tim Cook, who is the CEO now of Apple, said, quote, "Apple has lost a visionary and creative genius, and the world has lost an amazing human being," end quote. The board of directors said, quote, "Steve's brilliance, passion, and energy were the source of countless innovations that enrich and improve all of our lives. The world is immeasurably better because of Steve." Let me jump ahead. Bill Gates had a very nice statement. Remember, Bill Gates has been, to a large extent, his adversary for so many years. He said, quote, "Steve and I first met nearly 30 years ago and have been colleagues, competitors, and friends over the course of more than half of our lives. The world rarely sees someone who has the profound impact Steve has had, the effects of which will be felt for many generations to come." Paul Allen, who co-founded Microsoft, said, "We have lost a unique tech pioneer and auteur who knew how to make amazingly great products. Steve fought a long battle against tough odds in a very brave way. He kept doing amazing things in the face of all that adversity. As someone who has had his own medical challenges, I couldn't help but be encouraged by how he persevered," end quote. Now, Paul Allen has been sick with, I think, Hodgkin's disease for a long time, which is a form of cancer. Steve Ballmer, the CEO of Microsoft, said, I want to express my deepest condolences at the passing of Steve Jobs, one of the founders of our industry and a true visionary. My heart goes out to his family, everyone at Apple, and everyone who has been touched by his work." So let's jump ahead. Mark Zuckerberg of Facebook said, "Steve, thank you for being a mentor and a friend. Thanks for showing that what you build can change the world. I will miss you." Let's jump ahead. Steve Case, the former co-founder of AOL, said, quote, "I feel honored to have known Steve Jobs. He was the most innovative entrepreneur of our generation. His legacy will live on for the ages." Let's see. Let me see if I can. Walter Mossberg wrote, from a Wall Street Journal, wrote, quote, "He did what a CEO should, hired and inspired great people, managed for the long term, not the quarter or the short-term stock price, made big bets and took big risks." Michael Arrington of TechCrunch fame wrote, quote, "Damn, people like Steve Jobs are supposed to live forever, end quote. Roger Ebert, the film critic, said, quote, I'm reading about the loss of Steve Jobs on the 17th Macintosh I've owned, end quote. The president, Barack Obama, said, Steve was among the greatest of American innovators, brave enough to think differently, bold enough to believe he could change the world, and talented enough to do it. Okay, let's do one more. Let's see, from entertainment. George Lucas of Star Wars fame, said, the magic of Steve was that while others simply accepted the status quo, he saw the true potential in everything he touched and never compromised on that vision. He leaves behind an incredible family and a legacy that will continue to speak to people for years to come, end quote. And let's see, one more. Let's see. Well, I'm trying to look for the more memorable quotes. Let's go with LeBron James of NBA star fame. He says, rest in peace, Steve Jobs, someone who definitely left his mark on the world, innovators that will live and last forever. Okay, so that, those I think are some good quotes. Okay, but what's better than quotes about Steve Jobs passing away are quotes by Steve Jobs. And there's a nice website called quotationspage.com/quotes/Steve Jobs. And there's some great quotes here by Steve Jobs. So let's, here's some of the stuff that Steve said. Innovation distinguishes between a leader and a follower. He said, a lot of companies have chosen to downsize, and maybe that was the right thing for them. We chose a different path. Our belief was that if we kept putting great products in front of customers, they would continue to open their wallets. He said, be a yardstick of quality. Some people aren't used to an environment where excellence is expected. He said, I'm the only person I know that lost $250 million in 1 year. It's very character building. Of course, he said at the famous Stanford speech he gave in 2005, your time is limited, so don't waste it living someone else's life. Don't be trapped by dogma, which is living with the results of other people's thinking. Don't let the noise of others' opinions drown out your own inner voice. And most important, have the courage to follow your heart and intuition. They somehow already know what you truly want to become. Everything else is secondary. Another great quote he had from 1998 was, innovation has nothing to do with how many R&D dollars you have. When Apple came up with the Mac, IBM was spending at least 100 times more on R&D. It's not about money. It's about the people you have, how you're led, and how much you get it. When he got fired from Apple back in the 80s, he had this quote that comes from Playboy, 1987. He says, quote, I feel like somebody just punched me in the stomach and knocked all my wind out. I'm only 30 years old, and I want to have a chance to continue creating things. I know I've got at least one more great computer in me, and Apple is not going to give me a chance to do that. Well, the irony is Apple did give him a chance because he was able to return to Apple in 1997, and he really hit it out of the park. Again, from the Stanford commencement speech, he said the following, remembering that I'll be dead soon is the most important tool I've ever encountered to help me make the big choices in life. So that's pretty profound. He also said at that commencement speech, sometimes life is going to hit you in the head with a brick. Don't lose faith. Another thing from that speech, he said to Stanford graduates, you can't connect the dots looking forward. You can only connect them looking backwards. So you have to trust that the dots will somehow connect in your future. You have to trust in something, your gut, destiny, life, karma, whatever, because believing that the dots will connect down the road will give you the confidence to follow your heart, even when it leads you off the well-worn path. So these are very good quotes. When he described the Macintosh computer, he said, "Insanely great." Actually, that's kind of funny because Bill Gates, in eulogizing Steve Jobs, said it was insanely great knowing him. So that's actually a reference from Steve Jobs saying that years before about the Macintosh. Very interesting. Anyway, so those are the quotes, some of the best quotes, I think, from Steve. And if we have time, we'll go back to some others. Okay, but one of the things that's pretty impressive about Steve Jobs, and I think a lot of people don't realize that, is that he overcame so much. I mean, people think of Steve Jobs as this tough guy, and actually after a couple days now, there are some people on the internet who are saying, oh, he was mean, to some employees, he was like tough. But what people don't realize, and I think people don't really appreciate, is how much Steve Jobs overcame. And I think that's what really makes him inspirational, because someone who inspires other people teaches other people how to be better, how to be a more successful human being. And people who take pot shots at Steve Jobs don't realize that he overcame a lot. So I did this post, and I'll read it to you, and then we'll go through some of the stuff. I'll elaborate more. I said, quote, "As the internet is flooded with tributes and stories about Steve Jobs, and I have had a chance to sleep and wake up, and I have reflected. One thing that really inspires me about Steve Jobs in his life is how he overcame so much. Steve Jobs started life as an adoptee. He overcame that. Steve Jobs' parents, adoptive parents, were not college educated and had little money. He overcame that. Steve Jobs had to drop out of college because the cost of college was, in his judgment, an undue financial burden on his parents. He overcame dropping out of college. Steve Jobs and his friend Steve Wozniak had hardly any money and no experience running a company when they started Apple. He overcame that, and Apple became the fastest company to reach the Fortune 500. Steve Jobs was kicked out of the company he co-founded and created. He was kicked out by the CEO he recruited to come to Apple from Pepsi. Steve Jobs overcame that. He went on to create or helm two other significant companies, Next and Pixar, and then later was invited back to Apple. Steve Jobs started his second stint at Apple from 1997 until earlier this week with a public company that was in the verge of going out of business and in some way the laughingstock of the computer industry. He overcame that. Steve Jobs undertook the greatest turnaround in corporate America. He took Apple from the verge of bankruptcy to making it the most valuable public company in the world as measured by market capitalization. Steve Jobs was struck with cancer in 2004 at the age of 49, when in the prime of his life. He overcame that. While battling cancer for 7 years, Steve Jobs undertook arguably the most successful and creative period of his life. He grew the iPod and iTunes franchise to massive heights. He turned around the Macintosh line of computers. He released the wildly successful iPhone. He released the industry-transforming iPad and iPad 2. Steve Jobs has taught us how to overcome setbacks and reach glorious heights. Okay, so let's talk about some of that stuff. I mean, Steve Jobs' childhood, as compared to, let's say, the childhood of Bill Gates, Paul Allen, or Zuckerberg at Facebook. was really, really, much more of a hardship. Compared to these other tech giants, he had a much, harder life at the start of life. I mean, Zuckerberg, his dad is a pretty successful, wealthy dentist. Bill Gates' dad was a very successful, and I think still is alive, lawyer partner at a prominent Seattle law firm. And he went to, Bill Gates went to a very, private, expensive school. And it was the school that he went to. He was born the same year as Steve Jobs, 1955, Bill Gates. But their paths are a little different, Steve Jobs' path and Bill Gates' path. Bill Gates went to a rich prep school that had one of the few schools that had access to a mainframe computer. So he started programming in high school in the 60s, when most kids didn't have access to that. Steve Jobs, by contrast, he was adopted. His biological parents were graduate students, I guess, in Wisconsin, and his mother was from Wisconsin, and the father was a Syrian grad student, a guy from Syria, and basically they there's some information now that the mother's dad didn't want her to marry the Syrian grad student, and so they gave up Steve Jobs for adoption. And the original plan was that he'd be given up for adoption to someone who's college educated and would send him to college. And whoever was going to be the person who was going to adopt him backed out. And so then this other couple came along, the Jobses, from, I guess, Cupertino, California, who didn't have college degrees. And Steve Jobs' biological mother didn't want to let them adopt Steve. But then she changed her mind when they pledged to send Steve to college. And his dad was pretty blue collar, his adopted dad, Mr. Jobs, and he grew up in a sort of, I read a couple of biographies on Steve Jobs, and the sense that I got was he was sort of lower blue collar existence in Cupertino. And as he pointed out at his Stanford commencement speech, he went to Reed College for like a semester, which is a pretty good college, named after John Reed, the famous reporter who covered the Bolshevik Revolution, the American reporter. And he dropped out, he says, Steve Jobs said at the Stanford commencement speech, because it was too expensive. And he realized how enormously it was burdening financially his adopted parents. So he dropped out. Now, in contrast, Bill Gates dropped out of Harvard, but he didn't drop out of Harvard because he was under any financial constraints or his parents were. He dropped out of college, Bill Gates, because he saw the opportunity to create the Microsoft software company, because this computer company sort of came into existence called the Altair in Arizona, I think, or New Mexico. And so he had been dabbling in computers while still at Harvard, and he reached out to his high school friend, Paul Allen, who was at a different college, and said, hey, we can write software for this company. And it's sort of like what happened to Zuckerberg with Facebook. While in college at Harvard, Zuckerberg started Facebook, and while in college, Bill Gates started Microsoft. But so Steve Jobs didn't drop out of college to start Apple. In fact, he struggled. He had odd jobs here and there, very blue-collar jobs, and essentially he scraped his way, into the computer industry. And a lot of it was because he befriended and sort of hung out with a slightly older Steve Wozniak, who was the older brother of a high school classmate of Steve Jobs, who Steve Jobs had hung out with. And so, he had much more adversary. And he overcame that, and he created this company. Bill Gates had programming skills. Steve Jobs, had some technical skills, but really Wozniak was the real power. So, and Zuckerberg from Facebook, he also has programming ability. But Steve Jobs had something else. He had enough technical knowledge combined with style and taste and drive. He had just tremendous drive to succeed. But let's go through some of these other setbacks that he had that he overcame. I mean, he brought in Scully from Pepsi-Cola to be the CEO of Apple after Apple had its initial public offering in the early 1980s, and then he had a falling out with Scully. And the board sided with Scully, and at around the age of 30, which would have been around 1985, he was thrown out of the company. So around the time that I bought my first Macintosh, I don't think he was with Apple anymore. The Macintosh first was launched in January 1984. I bought a Macintosh in the summer of 86 I bought it. So what's amazing is so many people, like start a company, have great success, then get fired, and then you never hear from them again. And you did hear again from Steve Jobs, because he went on to create the next company, which was a computer company, and also Pixar. He bought Pixar, or what was Pixar corporate-wise, from George Lucas, and he made a company, put the resources into it, and hired the people that made Toy Story and changed the world of animation. Look at other overcoming major setbacks. I mean, when he came back to Apple in 1997, because Apple bought Next from him, and Apple was very low on cash, sort of had become irrelevant in the computer industry. And he took this company that he had founded that had been sort of decimated, and he turned it into, a powerhouse. He turned it around. So it's pretty amazing. This is a guy who really, addressed adversary. No, I think the thing that's truly amazing is he was struck with pancreatic cancer in 2004, and he's been battling something to do with that ever since, and that's probably what killed him, or the effects of it. But what's amazing is this. He gets this life-threatening disease in 2004, and then arguably his most successful creative period of his life is in the ensuing years. And I've said this before, it's truly amazing, because the iPod was doing well then. It had been launched in 2001, but it really took off after 2004 and became like a powerhouse. And then in 2007, he launched the iPhone. And then in 2009, he launched the iPad. And it's just amazing, and Apple, it's fitting that Apple this summer, before he died, surpassed not only Microsoft, but Exxon to become the most valuable public company in the world. And that's just an enormous, heroic achievement. My dad had, struggled with cancer for 7 years and passed away. And I just remember how much he struggled with just being afraid of dying, of cancer. In some ways, people who are sick with any any disease that strikes you physically, it's so easy to get demoralized and to give up and to not be productive because you're so obsessed with your situation. And what's amazing is that he achieved so much while under this terrible disease of cancer. So anyways, I to me, that's the most inspirational thing about Steve Jobs. Not that he just created the Macintosh and these other great devices, but he did it always in the face of major odds. I mean, he created Apple. He was relatively poor and didn't have the education, the technical education and skills of someone like Bill Gates or Mark Zuckerberg at Facebook. And he built this powerful company that, this beautiful Macintosh and the Apple II and the Apple. That's what's truly amazing. Okay, so one of the big things is that, Steve Jobs passed away the day after Apple had its big event on October 4th to announce, among other things, the iPhone 4S. Well, that was the big thing that Apple announced. And what's amazing is that he passed away the day after. Just in terms of timing, is it poetic? Is it ironic? I mean, that event, the keynote, was one of his most signature, things of his, running Apple. I mean, he was famous for these events, particularly after he came back in '97. And a lot of Apple's turnaround really had to do with the marketing that Steve did. I mean, I think these events that he had every year or multiple times a year helped sell the devices, because he just really could sell them. Once you heard one of these keynotes, you wanted to go run out and buy that product because it was so good. And he died the day after. Now, what's interesting is, we'll get into the announcement regarding the iPhone 4S and others, but some people, before Steve Jobs died, but after the October 4th announcement occurred, some pundits on the internet were criticizing Apple and Tim Cook, the new CEO, saying that their presentation was subdued, that it's nothing like Steve Jobs' presentation. And at the time, people were saying, oh, well, maybe, they want to take a different path. They can't really copy Steve Jobs. There's only one Steve Jobs. And so at the time, the question was, was Tim Cook and the other, the other participants, were they being subdued because they don't want to be like Steve Jobs? And also there were some announcements that just didn't pan out. Apart from there not being a so-called iPhone 5 that's just designed differently, some people were bummed out that Facebook wasn't there, and that Facebook didn't announce the iPad app that had been rumored. Well, in retrospect, it looks like now what was going on was that Apple and the top executives knew that Steve Jobs was gravely ill and was going to die. And maybe because of just being good taste, they're not going to go out and party and really celebrate and go over the top announcing the iPhone, because if you know that this guy who means so much to the company and to so many people is on the verge of death, how can you really go out and have some sort of over-the-top iPhone 4 presentation? So I think they struck the right balance, knowing what they knew. And, there is an article now that sort of confirms that they knew it. So 9to5mac.com has an article out today, October 7th, that says Apple executives knew Jobs' condition at iPhone 4S launch. Now, here's the thing. They have a picture, and some people who were looking at the video saw this after the fact, after Steve Jobs died. But during the keynote, which was held on Apple's campus, there was a chair in the front by the aisle that was marked reserved, and there was this black, I guess, thing that overhang the chair that said reserved. And a lot of people think that Apple kept that chair sort of there as a tribute to Steve, or in Steve's memory, that he's there too. Because if Steve had any physical way to get to the keynote and at least watch it or participate, he would have. And remember, Steve Jobs just resigned as CEO a month and a half ago at the end of August, and it was just the chairman. And a lot of people thought, oh, well, he must be very sick, because why would he ever give up being a CEO? Well, this 9to5Mac article says, according to Palo Alto Police Department spokeswoman Sandra Brown via Bloomberg, I guess they got this from Bloomberg News, Apple executives may have known Steve Jobs' condition at the time of the iPhone 4S launch event. It goes on to say, Apple informed police that Steve Jobs' passing was closed days before Apple's official statement confirming he had passed. As a result of the meeting, the police apparently put plans in place for officers to patrol Jobs' home after the news of his passing had broke. Of course, this was to keep crowds under control when Jobs supporters inevitably visited his home following the news. And so, obviously this makes sense. People just don't die of cancer like boom. They slowly deteriorate and they get closer to it. So it also says here in the article that Jobs' funeral is today. So anyways, so let's go back to the iPhone 4S, because I think that is his legacy. And if we're going to talk about Steve Jobs' life and his death, I think it's only fair and fitting that he died just after his next most important device was launched. So let's talk about it. Okay, so Apple on October 4th launched the iPhone 4S, and it's going to be available in stores on October 14th, Friday, and you can pre-order starting today. The pre-order started at 3 a.m. Eastern Time, midnight Pacific Time. And basically, with a 2-year plan at full subsidy, the prices are the same as last year in terms of the iPhone 4, $199 for a 16-gigabyte iPhone 4S in black and white, $299 for a 32-gigabyte iPhone 4S in black and white, and as a new size model up to 64 gigabytes at $399, and that's with a 2-year subsidy. That's a full subsidy. But since we don't have a lot of time since we talked about Steve Jobs' death, let me talk about some important things. A lot of people were, quote, disappointed with the announcement of the iPhone 4S because they said it's not an iPhone 5. And I think this is somewhat of a silly criticism. Actually, the iPhone 4S, which I ordered and which I'm going to get soon, is actually a huge upgrade from the iPhone 4, and I think anybody who wants a really great device should get it. And so why are people disappointed? Well, there had been rumors that there was going to be a new design of the iPhone, something with a tapered edge, thinner on one side and thicker than another. Now, I think that's ridiculous that people are disappointed because, first of all, there's a pattern in how the iPhones are going. Remember, we had the original iPhone, then the iPhone 3G, and then the body didn't change, and then the 3GS came out, and the body didn't change. And then after 2 years, the body did change, and it was the iPhone 4. So it makes sense to keep the same body and shape for 2 years. And here's why it makes sense. One, in terms of production, Apple needs to ramp up production, and if you suddenly change the body, you got to re-gear the factory and make new devices. And it's better to have a 2-year run. It's more efficient. Second, as a consumer, it's better for us because whenever there's a new body, accessories have to be repurchased because they don't fit with the device. And how about cases? You don't have a lot of cases. And I think one of the selling points for the iPhone is that there are such a lot of cases. Think about it, because there's only one shape and size to the current iPhone. And there's a huge cottage industry of third-party cases. And to a lot of people, that can be a selling point because Android devices, which are the major competitor, they come in all sorts of hardware shapes. So if you buy an Android device, you're not going to have a lot of choice as to what what case you're going to have. So it's a competitive advantage for Apple to keep the iPhone 4S in terms of shape being the same as the iPhone because there's a huge head start in cases. The other thing is that it's not about the case. It's not about the shape. The iPhone 4 shape is beautiful. This is one of the best. The iPhone 4 was one of the best phones out there in terms of beauty, shape. I mean, you've got the beautiful metal band. You've got the shape is balanced. You've got the glass back, and it's sort of stunning. So why play around with it? But the key things, what makes the iPhone 4S great is what's the new hardware. So the hardware that we have now, that's going to really change things. It has now a much better processor. It has a dual-core A5 chip, the same one that's in the iPad 2. And it also, so that results in twice as fast, processing power. And I think something like 7 times more powerful graphic processing. So it's going to make games much faster, and also apps are going to be much more powerful. The other thing is that the camera is much better, and the camera now has 8 megapixel, but it's not just about megapixels. It has technology and new optics that make it better. So it says here for megapixels, it says that the iPhone 4S camera gives you 8 megapixels. That's 60% more megapixels, and that they've engineered with a higher full well capacity to collect even more light. And they're saying it's going to do very well in low light. And also this camera can now shoot video in 1080p, which is great. But here's the thing. Having a better camera is the main reason, I think, for a lot of people to upgrade an iPhone from an iPhone 4 to an iPhone 4S. I mean, I have a Nikon D40, like regular DSLR camera, and I hardly ever use it because my iPhone 4 camera is so good, and I take a lot of pictures of my family, and I don't carry a regular camera anymore because I have my phone with me all the time, and it has a very good camera. And now with the iPhone 4S, you can have even a better camera, and that's critical. Apparently, the camera that's the most popular on Flickr for photo taking is the iPhone. And so, I mean, people who are like, oh, the iPhone 4S is no different than the iPhone 4, they're crazy. I mean, every generation of iPhone has had better and better cameras, and that's critical. So those two reasons alone would be reasons to get the iPhone. But the other thing is that in terms of software, the iPhone 4S is going to have a software feature that no iPhone is going to have, because Apple has integrated a truly revolutionary service or operating system into the iPhone 4S. And they've basically integrated artificial intelligence and voice recognition into the iPhone 4S by having the Siri app become part of the entire operating system. And this is huge, because I think years from now, when we think about this event and Steve Jobs' death, we're going to say that Steve Jobs died the day after he and Apple introduced the next paradigm of computing. Because what's a paradigm of computing? Well, Steve Jobs was instrumental in moving forward the paradigm of computing. Now, before the Macintosh was, well, actually, if you think about it, he's responsible for 4 paradigms of computing. The first paradigm was the first Apple computer, and the Apple II created the personal computer, the true personal computer that everyday people could get, instead of just pure hobbyists or like techno, people who could. Before that, it was very hard to have your own personal computer. Then he invented the next paradigm is to get away from typing computer commands to having the graphic user interface. And there's a famous episode where Apple Steve Jobs, they visit Xerox back in the late 70s. And actually, people think they just sort of like stumbled into Xerox and like looked around and stole ideas. No, that's not how it worked. If you read some books, Michael Moritz's book, the way they got the technology was they made a deal with Xerox. They gave Xerox a stock in Apple in exchange for the right to spend 3 days looking around Xerox's Park research facility in California. And they went around. So in other words, they paid in stock Xerox for the right to snoop around their lab and see what they're doing there. And what Steve Jobs saw was that Xerox had invented the graphic user interface. The whole Windows interface that you're accustomed to on the Mac operating system or on a Windows computer, well, that concept, we take it for granted now, the concept of having images and windows. But what are images and windows? They're really just representations of computer commands that could be executed in code, and the code is just 0101 bits. But, you and I can't write 001 bits, so instead, Xerox came up with the concept of let's having a point-and-click user interface. And so Steve Jobs took that and incorporated that into the Lisa and Macintosh. And that was the third paradigm. That's the second paradigm of computing, when computers became graphical user interfaces, which make it more like reality and easier for people to use. So he really invented that. Apple came out with the mouse. We all take the mouse for granted now, but when it first came out, people were laughing and saying this is a ridiculous way to input stuff into computers. So that second paradigm really controlled computing for a long time until the third paradigm. And what is the third paradigm? The third paradigm of computing is touch computing, touching a screen and moving objects. And Apple invented that with the iPhone. I mean, there was technically other people had touch, devices. I mean, when you went to a cash machine at a bank, that's a touch device. But the iPhone was the real first touch computing device that millions of people would buy and use like a computer. And that's what the iPad is too. So, but what's the fourth paradigm? Where are we going next? Well, the iPhone 4S is the clue, and Steve Jobs died the day that the fourth paradigm was entered. And the fourth paradigm is like interfacing with computers through voice. And you already do it to some degree. Using Dragon software, you can dictate into computers. But Apple has incorporated this Siri voice recognition and artificial intelligence technology. And basically, it's going to turn your iPhone 4S into a computer that talks back to you and that you can give instructions to orally. It says, Siri on iPhone 4S lets you use your voice to send messages, schedule meetings, place phone calls, and more. Ask Siri to do things just by talking the way you talk. Siri understands what you say, knows what you mean, and even talks back. Siri is so easy to use and does so much, you will keep finding more and more ways to use it. And there's a video on Apple's website which shows someone talking to their phone and giving instructions. For example, they highlight that Siri, it understands what you say. That's what Apple says. It says, talk to Siri as you would to a person. Say something like, quote, tell my wife I'm running late, end quote. Quote, remind me to call the vet, end quote. Quote, any good burger joints around here, end quote. And Siri answers you. It does what you say and finds the information you need, and then it hits you. You're actually having a conversation with your phone. So it's not just voice recognition. What Apple's saying is that Siri is technology where you'll have a conversation with your phone. And this is what science fiction was all about. Remember in 2001, they're talking to Hal, the computer, and the computer is asking questions back, and they're having a conversation. And the iPhone 4S is going to be the first real computer that does that on a mass level. Yeah, there are computers that do that already, but they're for scientists, and this is for people. We're going to have computers that talk to us. We're going to say to our television at some point, hey, any good shows? You know what I like. I'd like some comedy. Or any good shows. You're not going to put on a TV by clicking a button. You're going to talk. You're going to do all sorts of things. You're going to walk into your home and say, I want the lights on, I want some music on, and boom, that's going to happen. But it's all starting with this Siri technology. And this alone, I think, is reason to get the iPhone 4S. So, very cool technology. So these are my final thoughts on this week. This was a really huge week, and Apple news. I mean, two big things happened. Steve Jobs died, and we had the iPhone 4S announcement. And I don't think it's a coincidence. I think Steve held out. He held out and lasted till after the iPhone 4S came out. I think he willed himself to live that long because obviously he was very sick and deteriorating, and he saw the launch of really his final product. And it's funny because so many people don't understand how significant this product is. They poo-poo it, like I said, saying it's got the same shape as the iPhone 4, but they don't understand that the technology Apple has improved in the iPhone 4S from its predecessor are profound. This processor is much faster. The camera is much better. And together, having a faster processor and the software that's going to come out soon with iOS 5 are going to make the iPhone 4S really the best computer that has ever existed. It's not the best phone. People don't realize that he's invented here. It's computing. The phone is ancillary. Oh, and I left out some other important facts. In terms of a revolution in communication, Apple pioneered that with the iPhone, taking away power from the cell phone carriers who held all the power. And Apple now has further done that because this model iPhone 4S now works on Sprint as well as Verizon and AT&T. But more importantly, it has enough antennas in there so that you don't have to make different devices for different carriers. The same device that works on AT&T works on Verizon. Now, AT&T and Verizon are crippling it so that you can't just automatically take it after you're done at AT&T and move to Verizon or vice versa or with Sprint. But it's the same antenna, which means that jailbreakers will find a way to jailbreak the AT&T and Verizon and Sprint iPhones. And through jailbreaking, you'll be able to just move them to other carriers. But the point is, it's not just a phone. It's a computer that has some phone capabilities. And it's going to be truly a profound device. And I think years from now, people will realize that right when Steve Jobs died, right before he died, he launched the fourth paradigm in computing. So anyway, see you next week. This has been the Apple Podcast. This is Lex at Max Future. Thanks for listening, and I hope. Well, anyways, I hope you all can get through this difficult period with the peace of mind that we've saw the workings of a truly great man. Take care.
This has been a Max Future production.